students, welcome to Sunil's tutorial. I'm Sunil Bidwani and today we'll be doing this chapter called as genetic basis of inheritance. Let's see the law of dominance. Now, the law of dominance says that, suppose for example, first let me explain the law of dominance to you. Let's consider two contrasting characters. In a pea plant, let's take parental generation. Let's consider pure tall and do a cross of it with pure dwarf. Right? The genotype. The genotype for this is going to be PP. The genotype for this is going to be PP. Right? Pure tall and pure dwarf. Now if I make gametes, I will get, since this is pure tall, this is homozygous, I will get a gamete T, and here I will get a gamete T. Right? Now if I were to have fertilization, between these two, the F1 generation, I will get the F1 generation. The F1 generation would be all tall, right? So in which case the phenotype would be tall, but with hybrid seeds. Hybrid as in TT seeds. So my law of dominance says that whenever there is a cross between pure pair of contrasting characters, in the F1 generation you would have the dominant character, and the F2 generation you would have the recessive character. Fine, do we get this thing clear? So thus, in the law of dominance, what we understand is whatever is the phenotype, that is what you will see in the F1 generation. In the F1 generation, the character that would appear would be the dominant character, and the one that would be suppressed would be the recessive character. That is my law of dominance. So my law of dominance states that in a cross between two organisms, pure pair of any of contrasting characters, the character that appears in the F1 generation, is called dominant, and the one which is suppressed is called recessive. That's my law of dominance. Now let's try to understand this. I've already shown you the diagram for this, the law of dominance. Now let's see the explanation for this. Now, as you can see from the diagram, guys, can you just see the diagram? What did Mendel do? He performed a crossing experiment in garden pea plant, and he considered the pair of contrasting characters to be the height of the plant. Right? He took a pure tall genotype and he crossed it with a pure dwarf genotype. Fine. Now, which character is dominant and which character is recessive is not known to us. Is the tall character dominant character, or is the dwarf character dominant character? We do not know this, right? So which character was dominant and which was recessive was not known. When they were crossed on the plants, pollen grain and egg were taken and fertilization was obtained. What we got was a heterozygous seed, right? The seed, when it was sown in soil, it was noted that you would get all tall plants. Fine, do we get this in clear? This indicates that tall is the dominant character and dwarf is the recessive character. Fine, do we get this in clear? So he said that the character that appears in the F1 generation will be the dominant character, which does not appear in the F1 generation will be the recessive character. So the law of dominance says that whenever you have a pure pair of contrasting characters, whenever there is a cross between pure pair of contrasting character, the character that appears in the F1 generation, only one character will appear in the F1 generation phenotype. The character that appears in the F1 generation phenotype is going to be the dominant character and the other character is going to be the recessive character. Fine, do we get this thing clear? Can you just write this down? Mendel performed crossing experiments with garden pea. Mendel performed crossing experiment with garden pea plant considering the character height of the stem, considering the height of the stem. Right now, the expression of F1 hybrid was tall. Therefore, he said that the tall character is the dominant over dwarf. The expression of F1 hybrid was tall. The expression of F1 hybrid was tall. Therefore, he said that the tall character is dominant. The tall character is dominant over the dwarf. Right? Now, what he did was a pure tall plant of genotype, TT was taken and it was crossed, with a pure dwarf plant, with TT. Right? That was the experiment. Now, which character is dominant and which is recessive is not known. Which character is dominant and which character is recessive is not known. Right? Now, they were crossed. Once they were crossed, you would get a seed, right? One plant was taken for pollen grain and the other was taken for egg. One plant was taken, one plant was taken for pollen grain, that is, it was taken as male, and the other plant and other for egg. That's the female plant. So we considered one of it to be the male plant and the other to be the female plant. Fertilization takes place and a hybrid seed is obtained. Fertilization takes place and a hybrid seed is obtained. Fertilization takes place and a hybrid seed is obtained. This seed is sown in the soil and allowed to grow, and the expression is noted. This seed is sown in the soil, allowed to grow, and the expression is noted. And the expression is noted, right? The plant is a tall plant like one of the parents. The plant is a tall plant like one of its parent. The plant is a tall plant like one of its parent, which indicates that the tall character is the dominant over the dwarf. Which indicates that the tall character is the dominant character over dwarf. Right? So he found out that the tall character was the dominant character. Thus, TT in the pure plant, I could say that TT is a pure tall, right? Whereas in F1 the plant is heterozygous. Whereas in F1 the plant is tall but heterozygous. Tall but heterozygous, that means it has T and T, right? Hence, the dominant factor T suppresses the recessive factor T. Hence, the dominant factor capital T suppresses the recessive factor T. Right? The dominant character suppresses the recessive character. Apparently, the factor for tallness is dominant and does not allow the factor for dwarfness to express its effect. Apparently, the factor for tallness is dominant and does not allow the factor for dwarfness and does not allow the factor for dwarfness to express its effect. To express its effect. Right? And this is your law of dominance. Right? So out of the two character, one character is going to be suppressed in the F1 generation. The character that is suppressed in the F1 generation is called as recessive character. The character that is expressed in F1 generation is called as the dominant character. Fine, do you get this in here? So this is my first law of dominance. Fine, do we get this in here? Next, let's move on to the next law of dominance. That is my law of segregation. Law of segregation. Right? The law of segregation is also called as the second law of dominance. First, let us try to understand this with the help of a diagram. Let's see the phenotype of parents. Suppose if you did an experiment between tall pea plant and the dwarf pea plant. Tall plant and dwarf plant. The plant that I am considering is a pea plant. Right? So in this case, tall plant, I am considering pure tall, so its genotype. The genotype is going to be TT, and here the genotype is going to be TT. When you have gametes formed out of this, in gametes you would get the gamete T here and you would get the gamete T here. Right? Fertilization takes place. This is your gametes. Right? Fertilization takes place and you would get your F1 generation. This is my F1 generation. Right? Where you would have TT. You would have all tall hybrid. The phenotype would be tall, but the genotype would be hybrid. Right? Now, let's do selfing of F1 hybrid tall plants. Selfing of F1 hybrid tall plants. Right? So in which case my phenotype, parents or parent phenotype, is going to be F1 hybrid tall. I'm doing a cross with another F1 hybrid tall. Right? The genotype is hybrid, that means TT and TT. Right? Now, when you have gametes formed, you would have two different types of gametes formed. Either I would have the gamete T formed or T formed. Similarly, in the other one also you would have two different types of gametes formed, T and T. And that is what is your law of segregation. Law of segregation, it states that members remain together without mixing with each other and separate or segregate during the gamete formation. The contrasting characters, the contrasting allelic pair remain together without mixing with each other and separate or segregate during gamete formation. Thus, gametes receive only one of the two factors. Here you will see that the gametes would receive only one of the two factors, right? So organisms can be hybrid or pure, but the gametes will always be pure. An organism may have both identical characters, it may be homozygous or heterozygous, but gametes will always be in pure form, right? And that is what is my law of segregation. Right? Do we get this in here? Now, if once these gametes are formed, with these gametes I could have the F2 generation. Right? I could consider the male and female. So you have male, two gametes formed, T and T, female, two gametes formed, T and T, right? So if I made a checkerboard pattern for this, right, what I would get here is TT, TT, TT and TT. Tall, hybrid tall, and dwarf. Right? So you will see that in the F2 generation, the recessive character expresses itself. Fine, do we get this thing here? So the results in phenotype result phenotype ratio is going to be 3:1. That is 3 tall and 1 dwarf, and the genotype ratio 1:2:1. 1 pure tall, 2 hybrid tall, and 1 dwarf. Fine, do we get this thing here? So that is my law of segregation. Let's write the law of segregation. Law of segregation is also called as the second law of inheritance. Second law of inheritance. What is the first law of inheritance? The law of dominance is my first law of inheritance. Second law of inheritance is also called as law of segregation. Second law of inheritance is also called as law of segregation. Fine. Now, the law itself. The law states that members of the alic pairs remain together without mixing. Remain together without mixing. The members of the alic pair remain together without mixing with each other and separate without mixing with each other and separate during gamete formation. So at the point of gamete formation, these members would separate themselves. Thus, gametes receive only one of the two factors. Thus, gametes receive only one of the two factors. Fine, do we get this thing here? Organisms can be hybrid, but hybrid or pure, but gametes are always pure. Organisms can be hybrid or pure. Hybrid as in heterozygous, pure as in homozygous, right? But gametes are always pure. But gametes are always pure, right? That's my law of segregation. Law of segregation is therefore also known as the law of purity of gametes. Therefore, this is also known as law of purity of gametes. Right? Law of purity of gametes. So those are the different names given to law of segregation. Let's see the explanation of the law. Now, in Mendel's hybridization experiment using garden pea plant, Mendel's hybridization experiment using in garden pea plant, he considered the character height of the stem. He considered the character height of the stem. That was the character that he considered. Now, in a cross between homozygous tall pea plant and homozygous dwarf pea plant, the F1 generation was hybrid tall. We've already seen that in the diagram, right? Now, if the F1 generation was hybrid tall, that means the F1 generation considered two factors, tallness as well as dwarfness. Now, the F1 hybrid plants, in the F1 hybrid plants, both the factors, that is tallness and dwarfness, remain together without mixing. That's the first point of law of segregation, right? So, in a cross between homozygous tall pea plant, and homozygous dwarf pea plant, right? In a cross between homozygous tall pea plant and homozygous dwarf pea plant, in F1 generation, all hybrid tall plants were obtained. All hybrid tall plants were obtained. Right? The F1 hybrid plants contained two different characters. The F1 hybrid plants contain two different characters. They contain two different characters, that is T for tallness, and small t for dwarfness. Right? These were the two characters that they contain. Now in the F1 hybrid plants, these two factors remain together without mixing. In F1 hybrid plants, these two factors remain together without mixing. Right? The two factors would remain without mixing till gamete formation. The factors would remain together without mixing till gamete formation. So that was the first point of law of segregation, that the two factors would remain together without mixing, right, and they would separate out during the gamete formation. Now, when the F1 hybrid produces gamete, the two factors segregate from each other into different gametes, which I have shown you here. Guys, can you see this? When the F1 hybrids produce gamete, the two factors separate out from each other. As a result, each gamete contains T and T. Thus, every gamete is always pure for a particular character. Right? And that was the reason that we call this law as the law of segregation, as the law of purity of gametes. Fine, do we get this thing here? So I can say that when F1 hybrid produces gametes, when F1 hybrids produces gamete, the two factors factors T and T. The two factors segregate from each other into different gametes. Segregate from each other into different gametes. The two factors segregate from each other into different gametes, right? As a result, each gamete contains, each gamete contains T or T, right? Thus, every gamete is always pure for a particular character. Thus, every gamete is always pure for a particular character. Right? Now, that was the reason why we call this as law of purity also. Now, the appearance of the dwarfness in the F2 generation proves the law of segregation. We did not have this character in the F1 generation, and the fact that it comes back in the F2 generation, which shows that the gametes did not mix with each other, the two characters did not mix with each other. The two characters did not mix with each other and the gametes were pure. That is the reason why we have the character of dwarfness reappearing in the F2 generation. Fine. So I can say that the appearance of dwarf character in F2 generation, F2 generation proves the law of segregation. Right? The dwarf character must have received one gamete of T from each of the two hybrid tall parents, right? The fact that I have dwarfness reappearing in F2 generation, that means that is only possible when it has received the gamete T, small t, from each one of the hybrid selfing parents. I can say that the dwarf plant must have received one gamete containing T from each of the hybrid tall parents, right? Thus, the two factors T and T remain together in the F1 generation without mixing, which goes on to prove. Thus, the two factors T and T remain in the F1 generation without mixing. The two factors would remain together without mixing, and when the F1 hybrid plants produce gametes, these two factors separate out. When F1 plants produce gametes, these two factors separate out. Right? These two factors separate out, that is, these two factors separate from each other and enter into different gametes. This law is universal in occurrence, and as the segregation of any character takes place in all organisms. I can say that this law is universal in occurrence. This law is universal in occurrence as the segregation of yields for any character occurs in all organisms. Right? So do we understand this? This is my law of segregation. So law of dominance and law of segregation, right? Okay, we'll stop this here for the day. Thank you very much.